Many political terms are used interchangeably in day-to-day life, but can you differentiate between the concepts regime, government, state, and nation? When studying comparative politics, it is important to have a good understanding of each of these terms and know how to apply them properly, and how to apply them in context of the course countries if you are an AP Comparative Government student. Let's start by comparing the concepts state and nation. States are political organizations with governments that can control their populations, and they have internationally recognized territory. So you see that state has a population. That is a characteristic that it shares with the nation. And there's a government, though, that rules those people and is able to control them. The government often has what we call a monopoly on force. So, for example, police or military forces that they can use to enforce their decisions and make sure that the people actually do what the law says they are supposed to do. A state is also defined as a sovereign territory. That means there are clearly defined borders, the territory that these people live in, and that this government is allowed to rule over. Who allows that government to rule over them? Basically, other states. So that's what we mean when we say a sovereign state is internationally recognized. And this one is super important because if other states do not recognize your state as a sovereign nation, they may try to claim some of your territory. So that is why we sometimes will see border disputes or even disputes as to who the rightful government of a nation is or should be. Think about when the Taliban recently took control of Afghanistan again, and that there were many discussions as to if they should be recognized as the official government of Afghanistan. Now, as I mentioned, there can also be border disputes as to a certain part of a country. Does it belong to that state, or does it belong to the neighboring state? Think of Crimea being claimed or reclaimed by Russia from the Ukraine. And there are also separatist movements within states. So we will see a group of people or a certain area, territory, trying to become their own sovereign state. For example, Palestine and Israel. You also see the Kurds in several different states that are internationally recognized, and they want to form their own sovereign nation, Kurdistan. And so that is what you will often see, and that is why state sovereignty is so key, because it means that if you are an internationally recognized sovereign state, other forces will not interfere with the government's authority over the people, over its territory. When a government's authority is in question, that can lead to conflict. Now, states may have separatist movements as an example of such conflict, and this can maybe help us distinguish a state from a nation. A nation is a group of people with a shared identity. They share certain characteristics, such as culture or political identity. They might have a shared ethnicity or race, or they might share a certain language or religion. So while a state is a group of people, always has a group of people within it that the government controls, the nation is simply that group of people that feels united. A nation can also be a state. We do have nation states where there is one group of people that share these characteristics, that share an identity, and are all ruled by the same government in a single territory. But what we often see are so-called multinational states. So we see several national identities that are being ruled by one government. Take the United Kingdom as an example, where several nations, such as the Scots, the English, the Welsh, the Northern Irish, are all being governed by one British government within the British state of the United Kingdom. This can happen peacefully, but it can also be a source of conflict in these multi-nation states. For the United Kingdom, it was so when Ireland, not Northern Ireland, but the Republic of Ireland, that used to also be part of the UK, fought for independence and became its own nation state. So we have the Republic of Ireland as a nation state with a shared identity, internationally recognized borders, but we also have the nation of Northern Ireland that is part of the multi-nation state that is the United Kingdom. I hope you're still following me here. So, important to realize state and nation overlap in the sense that they will both have a group of people, but where the nation is the shared characteristics, the identity, the state is a political unity ruled by a government with clear, recognized boundaries, borders within its territory. So that is state and nation. Then we have government and regime. We talked about a government ruling a state. So what is a government? Basically, a government is a set of individuals or institutions that rule the country. So there will be individuals often in an institution, for example, people who are members of parliament, the individuals who compose that institution, parliament, form part of a government. Institutions are basically the organizations or the established sets of rules and practices. So the government, the ministries, those are the institutions, and then there are people who work in those institutions. And the government has power to make decisions for the states that they rule over. So what laws and policies do the people need to live by? A regime is a total system of core rules, all of the institutions together, and what all other rules are based on. So we'll often say a government is built upon a regime. Regimes are the foundations needed in order to build functioning governments, which typically means that a regime should last longer than a government where the institutions may continue to exist, but the people in those institutions will change on a regular basis. For example, the United States has a democratic regime and has had that since it was founded when the rules of this system were laid down in the Constitution, but the government of the United States will change usually every 4 to 8 years. So basically, when you are trying to remember the distinction between government and regime, remember the government is who rules the state, what people are in charge of making the rules at a given moment, and the regime is how the state is supposed to be ruled. What are the foundational principles upon which the government can make their decisions? We typically, and certainly if you are an AP Comparative Government student, differentiate between two types of regimes, democratic and authoritarian. That being said, it's a sliding scale. There is not just one type of authoritarian regime and one type of democratic regime. Not only are there many different types of democracies that AP COGO students will be learning about this year, and there are also different types of authoritarian regimes that can be differentiated between, but also putting countries in one of these categories can also change. Societies and politics are constantly in motion, so governments and even regimes can change. If a government maybe changes after 4 to 8 years, and then the people in that government implement policies that are either more democratic or more authoritarian, we may see a shift in one direction or the other. Or more radically, when there are revolutions, we might see an entire switch from one regime type to the other. For example, revolutions that replace authoritarian regimes with democratic regimes, or we'll often see military coups that may replace any regime type with an authoritarian military regime. Now, I've said it several times, the AP Comparative Government students watching this might be wondering, how do I put the 6 course countries in this framework? Well, this is generally how it will look. Again, sliding scales, things can change, but we have 3 examples in our course that fit the more authoritarian regime types and 3 examples that fit the more democratic regime types. China is our typical example of an authoritarian regime. It is the most authoritarian of all 6 of our course countries. It seems to be becoming even more authoritarian under Xi Jinping's current government. Then we have Russia, which is what we would call a hybrid or a liberal democracy, and both of those are authoritarian regime types because they are not really democratic. They might have some democratic elements, such as recent elections, but these were not really considered free or fair since so much was done by Putin's government to block the opposition. So Russia is seen as regressing to become more authoritarian, as it was under the USSR, whereas after the USSR fell, it went from being authoritarian to democratic. So you see how that can change through history. But currently, those of you taking this course, Russia is considered authoritarian, and to be more specific, it is an illiberal democracy, which is still authoritarian, also known as a hybrid form. Then we have Iran, which is called a democratic theocracy, and it is our typical example of a theocracy in this course. It is our one example of a theocracy, which means that the country is ruled based on the rules of religion. But it is also a democracy. There are democratic elements. So again, it is a hybrid regime, but because of the fact that it is a theocracy, it falls in this sliding scale on the side of authoritarianism. Next, we have our 3 examples of democracies, where 2 of those are considered developing democracies. Mexico, while under the PRI it was authoritarian, but since the PRI no longer fully dominates this political party system, Mexico has been transitioning into a more democratic regime in recent decades. So that's why we call it a developing democracy. It's not yet a full-fledged democracy, as still certain democratic processes need to be more fully institutionalized, but it is one of our democratic or developing democracies when we are looking at this regime type. Same goes for Nigeria. Nigeria has gone through several military regimes, which were authoritarian, since it gained independence as a former British colony. The current democratic regime is becoming more stable, as it was successfully the first successful peaceful transition of power from one democratic government to the other. So we really see that it becomes more consolidated and it is becoming more firmly entrenched, but there are still many other issues in Nigeria that we need to see addressed before it can be considered a full-fledged democracy. So Mexico and Nigeria are both developing democracies, which leaves us the United Kingdom, which for AP CoGo students is the course example of a full-fledged democracy. And that is not saying that it is a perfect democracy. There is no such thing as a perfect democracy. People are not perfect, therefore no country can be perfect because we make these systems. But it is our most consolidated democracy, which means that the institutions have been fully formed over centuries and are solidly entrenched within society, so it is not likely to quickly be toppled by an authoritarian regime or sudden change. So it is the most stable of our democracies, and that's what we mean when we talk about a full-fledged or consolidated democracy. So That is just to give you an idea of the 6 core countries for our AP Comparative Government students. And for those of you who are watching this for other courses or just because you're interested in politics, gives you an idea of how you can compare the regime types authoritarian to those that we call democratic. It's not just in the name, it is really in what policies, practices are in place. And for those of you who are AP Comparative Government students, you will be learning much more about that throughout the upcoming year. However, for now, I hope that you have a better idea how to differentiate between regimes, governments, states, and nations, remembering that regimes are stable, ongoing systems that determine how power is divided and how a state is ruled, whereas governments are changing and more who is actually ruling a state. A state is a political entity with a government that has an authority to control the people living within a territory recognized as a sovereign nation by other states. And finally, the nations are the group of people with a shared characteristics. Remember, the states can be a nation state with just one group of people with a shared identity, or multi-nation states where the government in that state rules over multiple nations within its territory.
Like this video. Subscribe for more lessons by Miss Mar.